Zay, and today I am back at you with another reaction video. Today I decided to react to Depression Era Water Pie, Tasting History with Max Miller. So, I saw this as a recommended video on my channel, and I was like, yeah, you know what? The world is going to crap, in America at least. Um, and you know what you're gonna need when the world officially goes all the way down to crap? You're gonna need food. And why not learn how to make depression era food if we're gonna be right back in that era again? It's it's kind of productive in a way, Like I'm being productive by watching this video. So be productive with me. Let's do it.
A few years ago, there was a trend online of people making water pie from the Great Depression. And so I decided that I wanted to try it, but when I went to look for the original recipe from the period, I couldn't find one. I did find some, but they were not from the Great Depression. So today I'm going to be making a water pie from 1908 and looking at the actual origin of this interesting dessert. So thank you to Our Place for sponsoring this video as I try my hand at water pie, this time on Tasting History.
So he's gonna be tasting it, and I want to know what it actually tastes like. Is it good? Is it nasty?
So the story that you'll see online is that water pie was invented during the Great Depression out of necessity. But if that was the case, you would think that there would be a recipe that had been printed in one of the many, many newspapers that was around at the time. They were printing pretty much every recipe that existed back then.
That's interesting.
But I couldn't find one. All that I could find when I searched were modern interpretations of what seems to be a dessert from a bygone era. Now, that's not to say that the dessert did not exist at the time. It
Probably
most
did.
surely did, because in 1982, a woman named Dolores Stone wrote in a newspaper asking people if they had a recipe for this pie that she remembers her grandmother making during the Depression. Last call for water pie recipe. Dolores Stone writes, back in 1936 in Cordell, Oklahoma, my grandmother made something called water pie for her 10 kids. It was made with sugar, water, and spices in a pie shell. I would love to hear from anyone who might know about this recipe. Now, maybe someone reached out to Dolores with a recipe, and I sure hope for her sake that they did, because I looked through many cookbooks from this period and couldn't find anything called water pie. But that's not terribly surprising because, frankly, if you could afford a cookbook, then you could afford to make a regular custard pie, which this is a version of. But I was surprised that it also didn't exist in any of the tens of thousands of newspapers that I have access to through multiple online archives. It wasn't anywhere. So I was beginning to think that this is one of those recipes that just never left the kitchen recipe box. But just as I began to think that I was...
It could have been a thing only because poor people, were making it and not rich people. They were like, it's not important enough to go inside of a recipe book. That's poor people stuff. Like, only they eat that. That's kind of what I'm feeling from this.
I was going to have to give up my quest to find a historic recipe. I came across a blog called History Reheated, where the author had the same dilemma that I was having, but she had it about a year ago, and she did find 2 recipes for water pie, but they were not from the Great Depression. In fact, they were from before the Great Depression, so that immediately debunks the idea that it was invented during the Depression. One recipe came in 1908, and another came in the 1880s, quite a bit before the Depression. And I'll be using bits of both to remake this pie, but I'm going to mostly be using the 1908.
I was waiting for this.
You were saying 08 recipe, which comes from the Fulton Gazette in Fulton, Missouri. And it was sent in by a Mrs. Hollis Cruz as a submission to the newspaper's cooking contest and says, water pie, 1 cup sugar, 2 tablespoons of flour mixed well with sugar, then add 1/2 cup of hot water, lump of butter, and flavoring. Cook until it becomes thick, then pour into your prepared paste and bake slowly. So most of the ingredients are the same as what you'll usually find online, the modern interpretation, but what's different is that this recipe has you mix the ingredients and then cook them before putting them into the pie shell.
Sorry, I just heard my roommates come in. I'm like, what's going on out there? Sorry. Let's continue.
Other modern interpretation usually has you just kind of add everything into the pie shell and then put butter on the top. And I guess it works as well, but that is kind of the major difference. Now, this is really supposed to be like a custard pie. And I know that because in an 1886 recipe, it says this is a good substitute for custard pie when milk is scarce. And so, just like I would with most custard pies, I'm going to blind bake the crust so it doesn't end up all soggy and gross at the end.
Okay.
As far as the pastry that I'm going to do, I am going to use a recipe from Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School cookbook, which was extremely popular in 1908, and she has several recipes for pastry. Most of them have either butter or lard or shortening. I'm going to do one that has butter and lard. Specifically 1/4 cup or 55 grams of lard or shortening, and 1/4 cup or 55 grams of butter. Then 1½ cups or 180 grams of flour, a half teaspoon of salt, and some ice cold water. And the process to make this is slightly different than most pie crusts that I've ever made. It has you whisk together the flour and the salt, and then cut the lard into the flour with a knife or your fingertips, and then you add just a little bit of cold ice water, enough to make it come together into a dough. Took me about 3 tablespoons. And then put that dough onto a floured surface and knead it just a couple of times to bring it together, and then flatten it out, and then put the butter, which should be cold, on top of the dough and fold it over and give it a few rolls with a rolling pin. I guess it's kind of like a rough puff pastry, but not exactly. Fold it over a couple more times while rolling, and that is it. There should still be pretty big chunks of butter left in the dough. And the recipe says it can be used straight away, or you can chill it, and I opted to chill mine in the refrigerator for 30 minutes before rolling it out and lining a pie dish with it, crimping the edges, and then poking some holes in the bottom, and then I lined it with aluminum foil, but you can use parchment as well, and fill it with baking beans. So you can blind bake it at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius for 15 minutes, then take it out of the oven, remove the hot baking beans, and return it to the oven and bake for another 5 or 6 minutes, or until the bottom is pretty much done. And then you want to let the crust cool completely before you make your filling, which will be made in a saucepan like this one from today's sponsor, Our Place. This saucepan is part of Our Place's Titanium Pro line of cookware, and just like the rest of the line, it's non-stick without relying on the plastics and chemical coatings like PFAs that most non-stick cookware uses. And because of that, you can actually use metal utensils on these pots and pans, and you can actually put them in the dishwasher. They're very easy to clean, but you can put them in the dishwasher. And since they are made with titanium, they are 3 times harder than your stainless steel pans, and they are considerably lighter, which is really nice. They've really just become kind of my standard everyday cookware because they're in that sweet spot between really durable, easy to use, non-stick, and dishwasher friendly, which I just love. And all of this month until December 1st, Our Place is having their biggest sale of the year with prices lower than I have seen all year. And if you're watching this after the Black Friday sale ends on December 1st, you can use my code HISTORY10 to get 10% off of your first purchase. That's 10% off with HISTORY10.
That's not
and
bad.
now let us make this pie filling, for which you will need 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar, 2 tablespoons of flour, 4 tablespoons or 55 grams of butter, 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of warm water. This is a little bit more than the 1908 recipe calls for and a little bit less than the 1880s recipe calls for, so I just kind of met in the middle and hope that that worked out.
Okay.
Also, the later recipe actually just says add flavoring, but it doesn't tell you what flavoring. The older recipe says it should be nutmeg, so I added that. I added a 1/4 teaspoon, but then I also added some vanilla, which was very popular in 1908. I added 1½ teaspoons of that. I don't think it's bad to add both. You could probably add something else because I have a feeling this pie is going to be in desperate need of some flavor. So just mix the flour and the sugar together in a saucepan, and then add the butter and the water and the flavorings, and set it on the stove over a medium heat. After about a minute, the butter should melt and you can stir everything together, and then after a couple more minutes, it will begin to thicken up. This is all due to the sugar and the flour. The 1889 recipe actually also includes an egg, which would really make it more like a custard, but this recipe, no egg. Once your filling thickens, pour it directly into the cooled pie crust, and since my crust was much deeper than expected, I decided to make another batch of filling and add that in as well, especially since a lot of the liquid will evaporate off. But if you are using a pre-made pie crust that's kind of already in one of those little tins, one batch of filling should do. Then put the pie in the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit, 220 Celsius for 15 minutes, then drop the temperature to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius, and bake for another 45 minutes. Honestly, I do not know if that's enough because unlike a traditional custard with milk and eggs, which will set in the oven as it cooks, this remains liquidy, pretty much the same as it was when it went in, and it doesn't set until it cools.
That's good.
So how you know it's done, kind of a mystery, so hopefully that works. But after about an hour total, you can take it out and let it cool completely. It really does take about a half a day to cool. It does need to cool completely to firm up, but that gives us plenty of time to go back and look at some of the origins of water pie.
It's hard out here in the Depression era. You gotta be kidding me.
So since these water pie recipes come from decades before the Great Depression, it is obvious that this pie was not invented during the Depression as a result of the hard times people were facing in the 1930s. But that doesn't mean that it didn't come from hard times. In fact, the Florida agriculturalist in 1889 makes it very clear that that is precisely why this pie exists. The 1880s had this recipe kind of bouncing all over newspapers for about a decade, and in 1889 it is couched in kind of a conversation between two women who were trying to figure out ways to economically feed their family. "I skip all your recipes which call for cream and over 3 eggs, said our economical friend the other day as we seated ourselves in her cheery sitting room for a morning call. "In the first place, downright cream is not to be had in these parts, and a pudding or pie with more than 3 eggs for an ordinary family is a sin." And she shook her head with such an air of positiveness that was meant to be convincing at least. "I have one here," said I am sure you will like. You see, it speaks for itself as economy. Cold water pie. 2 tablespoons of flour, level. 2 tablespoons of sugar, heaping. 1 egg, a small tablespoon of melted butter, nutmeg, and a good half pint of water. That will make 1 pie. "That sounds somewhat like it," she said, "and good, too. I used to make just such pies and custards when I first came to Florida over 20 years ago. It was almost before the days of condensed milk. At least it was very high in price. And as to getting a pint of milk from these fractious Florida cows was to pay pretty dearly for it. Oh, we did have a hard time the first year or two." See, while the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression are what often comes to mind when we think of hard times in America, the country had actually had a series of smaller depressions in the decades leading up to it, including one called the Long Depression, which started with the Panic of 1873 following a post-Civil War speculative bubble, and that lasted until 1879, or by many accounts, 1899, since during those last 20 years, they had a recession just about every year to 18 months. It was, after all, the Gilded Age, when a few uber-rich people at the top were doing just fine, and then everyone else was forced to make things like water pie. Another economic collapse took place just as the 1908 recipe was being printed, because that followed the Panic of 1907, when there was a run on the Knickerbocker Trust Company, and that led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System, but not before making life considerably harder for the majority of people in the country. Now, all of these paled in comparison with what would take place in the 1930s during the Great Depression, but people were having hard times long before that happened. So my question is, if people couldn't afford the ingredients to make a proper pie, then why did they feel the need to make a pie at all? I mean, I like pie, but I wouldn't call it essential, really, at least not today. But it turns out that around the turn of the 20th century, pie and other baked goods were rather essential for many people. In 1907, it was written that in no other country or at any other time has the demand for good baked stuffs been so great as it is at the present time in this country. The time has now come, whether it be in the home of the humblest workman or in the mansion of the rich, the cook or housewife is more praised and esteemed for her good bread, biscuits, pastries, and cakes than for anything else. See, unlike today, where pie is typically seen as an occasional treat, pies during the turn of the 20th century were often a staple of many Americans' diet. In 1899, the city of New York consumed 80 million full-sized pies a year, over 23 pies per person. And that doesn't count homemade pies, but just the manufactured pies that came from the 21 pie-making factories that surrounded the city.
That's crazy.
See, at that
we
time,
did not eat pies
pie
like that no
was on the level of
I love me a good
steel
cheesecake.
and railroads. There was the
Don't get
Steel
me
Trust
wrong,
and the Railroad Trust, and there was a burgeoning Pie Trust, a monopoly where one company, the American Pastry and Manufacturing Company, owned 19 of those pie-making factories that surrounded the city. Pies were held in such high esteem that there were articles condemning this pie trust, which threatened the diversity of this most important dish.
Consider it
the pie is an article of necessity in every household, as much so as the bed or the cooking stove. Other dishes have come and gone to suit the fickle whims of the public, but pie remains. It is hallowed by maternal associations and family memories. Its virtues have been celebrated by our best essayists and sung by our great poets.
Because people
love cake. A trust in pie should be as abhorrent to the American people as a trust in family Bibles or family trees. The monopolists must keep their greedy hands off that good familiar creature. Makes you feel downright patriotic. But it turns out that even back then, pie had its detractors, and partly this was because it was associated with the working class, and it turns out that there were a bunch of pie snobs out there, like Rudyard Kipling, author of The Jungle Book. Surely he was influenced by the fact that in the UK, pies were also typically a food of the common people at this time. And so, when living in New England, he wrote that I live within the Great Pie Belt. It extends through the New England states and through northern New York. Pie is a habit all over the eastern states. In the West, it is a debauch. Have you ever considered the moral and physical condition of a people which eats pie for breakfast, pie for dinner, pie for supper? Snob and a half. But it was not only the foreigners who were condemning our American pie-eating habits, but also domestic authors. In 1902, a New York Times columnist, Kate Masterson, took the country to task in her article, The Great American Pie. Pie really is an American evil. It is not only notoriously unhealthy, but it lacks all those subtle distinctions which should mark all foods, especially the dessert. Persons fond of pie have a way of classing it as a diet rather than a dessert. Pie, however, cannot be taken seriously as a food. Of course, no dessert should be serious, for that matter, but it ought to be palatable, piquant, delicate, and possessed of the psychic suggestion which is part of all properly composed dishes. She goes on to say that pie is immoral and puts it in a category with cigar smoke, paint, and turpentine. She says those that eat pie frequently are dyspeptic, and they gorge themselves at the cafeterias and pie bakeries of America. Pie eaters at a lunch counter are as hysterical and unmannerly as women at a bargain sale. They mass themselves and wedge solidly toward their magnet.
There's one thing I do not mess with, it is
are,
pie.
like those of every other injurious food, insidious. No great man was ever fond of pie. No important work was ever consummated on a pie diet. Pie is a clog on the spirit and a ball and chain on the imagination.
You know me and my always tiredness. Stop that.
Wow, this lady really hates pie.
Yeah, she
really
hates
pie. Or at least that's
pie.
what I thought at first, but it turns out that Kate Masterson, in addition to being a wonderful journalist, of which there were few female journalists at the period, she was also a satirist. And so she is actually not making fun of the pie eaters here. She is making fun of the people, the snobs, who look down on the pie eaters, because there were all these other articles, a little less hyperbolic, that were talking about poor people eating pie. They also often said that pie was just unhealthy because the amount of lard that was always put into the crust, and you know, maybe they have a point. But unhealthy or not,
the poor people are
I love a
eating
good
cake.
piece of pie.
They're eating ice cream.
So My only
They shouldn't be
question
doing
is,
that. I don't want
am
to
I
give
about
them
to
that.
have a good piece of
It's the
pie
same thing.
or not? And here we are, water pie from 1908. I am actually quite shocked at how firmed up this is, considering that it's
Looks like pie.
mostly water and sugar, you know? It is not the prettiest thing I've ever seen. The butter has like congealed on top. So that's what it is. But let's give it a taste.
I want to see how that tastes. Tell me. What's your honest opinion, young man?
Actually pretty good.
Yeah?
It's actually really good. I'll have more.
I think I'm gonna have to try this.
So you get a little, that nutmeg and the vanilla. That's the flavors. There's nothing else there.
No sugar?
Except for sugar, really.
Huh.
So I think whatever flavoring you add is very, very important with this. You know, you could add maybe lemon, kind of make a lemon meringue flavor, key lime or something like that, or
Okay.
another spice. I don't know. You can do a lot of different flavors with it, but that's what it is. It's a really great vessel for whatever flavor. I think the butter is very important. It does give it a richness. It's firm without being super firm. It's kind of like a custard, but a little bit softer. I think if it was cold, it would be even firmer.
Is it good though?
That's really good. So as the water kind of evaporated, it left like a caramel ring around the pie crust. And the crust itself is really, really good. Super, super flaky, super buttery. Yeah, I'm actually really surprised at how much I like this pie.
That makes sense though.
Thanksgiving is just around the corner. So if you don't want to do your normal like pecan pie or pecan pumpkin pie, this would be a cool alternative. Actually, that's kind of the texture. Is the texture of the filling reminds me of the filling of a pecan pie. So if you like that texture, kind of gloopy, but semi-firm,
Looks like sorry.
you like this pie. So maybe it doesn't come from the Great Depression, but it surely was popular during the Great Depression, I have no doubt. And maybe it can be popular again because it's pretty darn good, it's pretty darn easy, and yeah, you should make it. So enjoy your water pie, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Bye. Well, that was interesting. I think I'm down to try and make some Great Depression pie. Great Depression. It's not really Great Depression pie. No, I guess it's just water pie, huh? I'm down to make some water pie. That sounds delicious. And he liked it, and he also said that the flavoring is very important. Of course it is. It's a pie. So, yeah.